This is Chapter 55 of Pride and Prejudice, or Chapter 13 of Volume 3. A few days after this visit, Mr. Bingley called again, and alone. His friend had left him that morning for London, but was to return home in 10 days' time. He sat with them above an hour, and was in remarkably good spirits. Mrs. Bennet invited him to dine with them, but with many expressions of concern, he confessed himself engaged elsewhere. "Next time you call," said she, "I hope we shall be more lucky." He should be particularly happy at any time, and company, and if she would give him leave, would take an early opportunity of waiting on them. "Can you come tomorrow?" Yes, he had no engagement at all for tomorrow, and her invitation was accepted with alacrity. He came, and in such very good time that the ladies were none of them dressed. In ran Mrs. Bennet to her daughter's room in her dressing gown, and with her hair half finished, crying out, "My dear Jane, make haste and hurry down. He is come. Mr. Bingley is come. He is indeed. Make haste, make haste. Here, Sarah, come to Miss Bennet this moment and help her on with her gown. Never mind Miss Lizzie's hair." Poor Elizabeth. "We will be down as soon as we can," said Jane, "but I dare say Kitty is forwarder than either of us, for she went upstairs half an hour ago." "Oh, hang Kitty! What has she to do with it? Come, be quick, be quick! Where is your sash, my dear?" But when her mother was gone, Jane would not be prevailed on to go down without one of her sisters. The same anxiety to get by themselves was visible again in the evening. After tea, Mr. Bennet retired to the library, as was his custom, and Mary went upstairs to her instrument. Two obstacles of the five being thus removed, Mrs. Bennet sat looking and winking at Elizabeth and Catherine for a considerable time, without making any impression on them. Elizabeth would not observe her, and when at last Kitty did, she very innocently said, "What is the matter, mamma? What do you keep winking at me for? What am I to do?" "Nothing, child, nothing. I do not wink at you." She then sat still 5 minutes longer, but unable to waste such a precious occasion, she suddenly got up, and saying to Kitty, "Come here, my love, I want to speak to you," took her out of the room. Jane instantly gave a look at Elizabeth, which spoke her distress at such premeditation, and her entreaty that she would not give in to it. In a few minutes, Mrs. Bennet half opened the door, and called out, "Lizzie, my dear, I want to speak with you." Elizabeth was forced to go. "We may as well leave them by themselves, you know," said her mother, as soon as she was in the hall. "Kitty and I are going upstairs to sit in my dressing room." Elizabeth made no attempt to reason with her mother, but remained quietly in the hall till she and Kitty were out of sight, then returned into the drawing room. So, Mrs. Bennet wants Jane and Bingley to be alone together. If you remember, when Mr. Collins and Elizabeth are alone, he proposes to her. So Mrs. Bennet is hoping that just by leaving Jane and Bingley alone together, that Bingley will be compelled to propose to Jane. So she keeps trying to get them to go out of the room, her, Kitty, and Elizabeth, and she keeps winking, and Elizabeth is just totally ignoring her. She can tell that Jane doesn't want to be left alone with him. She doesn't feel quite comfortable yet, and then Kitty just does not realize what's happening at all and asks, why is she winking? So Mrs. Bennet finally gets Elizabeth to come out of the room, but Elizabeth just goes back in once Mrs. Bennet leaves her alone. So she doesn't want to abandon poor Jane. Mrs. Bennet's schemes for this day were ineffectual. Bingley was everything that was charming, except the professed lover of her daughter. His ease and cheerfulness rendered him a most agreeable addition to their evening party, and he bore with the ill-judged officiousness of the mother, and heard all her silly remarks with a forbearance and command of countenance particularly grateful to the daughter. So Mr. Bingley puts up with Mrs. Bennet's nonsense. He scarcely needed an invitation to stay supper, and before he went away an engagement was formed, chiefly through his own and Mrs. Bennet's means, for his coming next morning to shoot with her husband. So Mr. Bingley is going to come back. In this case, engagement just means an appointment, so he's going to come back and go hunting with Mr. Bennet. After this day, Jane said no more of her indifference. Not a word passed between the sisters concerning Bingley, but Elizabeth went to bed in the happy belief that all must speedily be concluded, unless Mr. Darcy returned within the stated time. Seriously, however, she felt tolerably persuaded that all this must have taken place with that gentleman's concurrence. So Elizabeth is pretty convinced. Jane's not saying that she doesn't like Mr. Bingley anymore, that she doesn't care about him. So Elizabeth is pretty convinced that things will turn out well for them as long as Mr. Darcy doesn't come back and interfere. However, she also thinks that Mr. Darcy may have gave his blessing to Bingley to go ahead and be with Jane. Bingley was punctual to his appointment, and he and Mr. Bennet spent the morning together as had been agreed on. The latter was much more agreeable than his companion expected. There was nothing of presumption or folly in Bingley that could provoke his ridicule, or disgust him into silence, and he was more communicative and less eccentric than the other had ever seen him. Bingley, of course, returned with him to dinner, and in the evening Mrs. Bennet's invention was again at work to get everybody away from him and her daughter. Elizabeth, who had a letter to write, went into the breakfast room for that purpose soon after tea, for as the others were all going to sit down to cards, she could not be wanted to counteract her mother's schemes. So Mr. Bennet and Mr. Bingley go hunting together. And Austen writes, the latter was much more agreeable than his companion expected. So Mr. Bennet's the second person mentioned in that sentence. And Mr. Bennet is not on his usual sarcastic behavior because he really doesn't have anything to make fun of Mr. Bingley for. He's very polite and nice, and Mr. Bennet can't think of anything sarcastic to say, and so he doesn't say anything that would be off-putting, and that seems to go pretty well. Mrs. Bennet is still trying to get Bingley and Jane alone together, though. But on her returning to the drawing room when her letter was finished, she saw to her infinite surprise there was reason to fear that her mother had been too ingenious for her. On opening the door, On opening the door, she perceived her sister and Bingley standing together over the hearth as if engaged in earnest conversation, and had this led to no suspicion, the faces of both, as they hastily turned around and moved away from each other, would have told it all. Their situation was awkward enough, but hers she thought was still worse. Not a syllable was uttered by either, and Elizabeth was on the point of going away again, when Bingley, who as well as the other had sat down, suddenly rose, and whispering a few words to her sister, ran out of the room. Jane could have no reserves from Elizabeth, where confidence would give pleasure, and instantly embracing her, acknowledged with the liveliest emotion that she was the happiest creature in the world. So Elizabeth goes away to write a letter, so she doesn't want to really be part of any of Mrs. Bennet's plans to get them alone together. But then when she comes back to the drawing room, it's just Bingley and Jane talking pretty seriously by the fireplace, and they're startled when she comes back in. And then Jane tells Elizabeth that she's the happiest woman or happiest person. Happiest creature in the world. So that's looking pretty good. 'Tis too much, she added, by far too much. I do not deserve it. Oh, why is not everybody as happy? Elizabeth's congratulations were given with a sincerity, a warmth, a delight, which words could be but poorly express. So they are engaged, Bingley and Jane. Every sentence of kindness was a fresh source of happiness to Jane, but she would not allow herself to stay with her sister, or say half that remained to be said for the present. I must go instantly to my mother, she cried. I would not on any account trifle with her affectionate solicitude, or allow her to hear it from anyone but myself. He has gone to my father already. Oh, Lizzie, to know what I have to relate will give such pleasure to all my dear family. How shall I bear so much happiness? She then hastened away to her mother, who had purposely broken up the card party and was sitting upstairs with Kitty. Elizabeth, who was left by herself, now smiled at the rapidity and ease with which an affair was finally settled, that had given them so many previous months of surprise and vexation. And this, said she, is the end of all his friends' anxious circumspection, of all his sister's falsehood and contrivance, the happiest, wisest, and most reasonable end. So Elizabeth is very happy that they're engaged. In a few minutes she was joined by Bingley, whose conference with her father had been short and to the purpose. Where is your sister? Said he hastily, as he opened the door. With my mother upstairs. She'll be down in a moment, I dare say. He then shut the door, and coming up to her, claimed the good wishes and affection of a sister. Elizabeth honestly and heartily expressed her delight in the prospect of their relationship. They shook hands with great cordiality, and then, till her sister came down, she had to listen to all he had to say of his own happiness, and of Jane's perfections, and in spite of his being a lover, Elizabeth really believed all his expectations of felicity to be rationally founded, because they had for basis the excellent understanding and super-excellent disposition of Jane, and a general similarity of feeling and taste between her and himself. So, Bingley shares the news with Elizabeth as well, and usually, Elizabeth is thinking that usually someone in love is kind of looking at things with rose-colored glasses, just has a very optimistic view, but in Bingley and Jane's case, Elizabeth does believe that all of Bingley's happiness is true and deserved, and that they really will be very happy together. It was an evening of no common delight to them all. The satisfaction of Miss Bennet's mind gave such a glow of sweet animation to her face as made her look handsomer than ever. Kitty simpered and smiled, and hoped her turn was coming soon. Mrs. Bennet could not give her consent, or speak her approbation in terms warm enough to satisfy her feelings, though she talked to Bingley of nothing else for half an hour, and when Mr. Bennet joined them at supper, his voice and manner plainly showed how really happy he was. So Mrs. Bennet's thrilled, Mr. Bennet's also happy, it's good news for everyone. Not a word, however, passed his lips in allusion to it, till their visitor took his leave for the night, but as soon as he was gone, he turned to his daughter and said, Jane, I congratulate you. You will be a very happy woman. Jane went to him instantly, kissed him, and thanked him for his goodness. "You are a good girl," he replied, "and I have great pleasure in thinking you will be so happily settled. I have not a doubt of your doing very well together. Your tempers are by no means unlike. You are each of you so complying that nothing will ever be resolved on, so easy that every servant will cheat you, and so generous that you will always exceed your income." "I hope not so. Imprudence or thoughtlessness in money matters would be unpardonable in me." "Exceed their income, my dear Mr. Bennet!" cried his wife. "What are you talking of? Why, he has 4,000 or 5,000 a year, and very likely more." Then addressing her daughter, "Oh, my dear Jane, oh, my dear, dear Jane, I am so happy. I am sure I shan't get a wink of sleep all night. I knew how it would be. I always said it must be so, at last. I was sure you could not be so beautiful for nothing. I remember as soon as ever I saw him, when he first came into Hertfordshire last year, I thought how likely it was that you should come together. Oh, he is the handsomest young man that was ever seen." So, very good news on all sides. Of course, Mr. Bennet has to have a little bit of sarcastic remark. He's genuinely happy for Jane, but he says that they're both, they have similar tempers, so they're not unlike, so they are alike, their tempers. And he says that they'll be very pleasant and happy. They're so complying, so they're so willing to listen to other people and agreeable that they'll never figure anything out. So kind of like, if you're trying to talk to a friend and figure out like what movie you're watching and you both say, "Oh, you pick, oh, you pick." Mr. Bennet saying that same thing will happen. So easy that every servant will cheat you, so they're not going to be very harsh with anyone who works for them, so servants will maybe not be honest because of that. And then again, he says, they'll be so generous that they'll always exceed their income, so they'll spend more than they earn because they're so giving to other people. So it's kind of like a weird, like funny but backhanded compliment in a way, very Mr. Bennet-ish. Wickham and Lydia were all forgotten. Jane was beyond competition her favorite child. At that moment she cared for no other. Her younger sisters soon began to make interest with her for objects of happiness which she might in future be able to dispense. So now Jane is Mrs. Bennet's favorite daughter because she makes a better marriage than Lydia. Ouch. And now her younger sisters, so Mary and Kitty, are going to ask Jane for things. Mary petitioned for use of the library at Netherfield, and Kitty begged very hard for a few balls there every winter. So Mary wants the library access at Netherfield, and Kitty would like balls at Netherfield. So they're just both asking Jane for things. Bingley from this time was of course a daily visitor at Longbourn, coming frequently before breakfast and always remaining till after supper, unless when some barbarous neighbour who could not be enough detested had given him an invitation to dinner, which he thought himself obliged to accept. Austen's using barbarous like sarcastically there, so she's thinking how terrible it is for anyone else to invite Bingley to dinner because then he's not spending time with Jane. Very likely a reflection of Mrs. Bennet's views. Elizabeth had now but little time for conversation with her sister, for while he was present Jane had no attention to bestow on anyone else, but she found herself considerably useful to both of them in those hours of separation that must sometimes occur. In the absence of Jane he always attached himself to Elizabeth for the pleasure of talking of her, and when Bingley was gone, Jane constantly sought the same means of relief. So Elizabeth listens to Jane talk about how great Bingley is, and Bingley talk about how great Jane is whenever one of them is not there. "He has made me so happy," said she one evening, "by telling me that he was totally ignorant of my being in town last spring. I had not believed it possible." "I suspected as much," replied Elizabeth, "but how did he account for it?" "It must have been his sister's doing. They were certainly no friends to his acquaintance with me, which I cannot wonder at, since he might have chosen so much more advantageously in many respects. But when they see, as they trust they will, that their brother is happy with me, they will learn to be contented, and we shall be on good terms again, though we can never be what we once were to each other." So Bingley tells Jane that he didn't know she was in London at all, and that obviously makes her feel relieved, and Jane thinks that it's his sisters who concealed that fact from him. And then she hopes that they'll be content, Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, so Mr. Bingley's sisters. She hopes that they'll be content, but they'll never be what they once were to each other, so they'll never be as good friends as they initially were, or at least as Jane initially thought they were, since the Bingley sisters never really liked her. "That is the most unforgiving speech," said Elizabeth, "that I ever heard you utter. Good girl! It would vex me, indeed, to see you again the dupe of Miss Bingley's pretended regard." Would you believe it, Lizzie, that when he went to town last November, he really loved me, and nothing but a persuasion of my being indifferent would have prevented his coming down again? He made a little mistake, to be sure, but it is to the credit of his modesty. This naturally introduced a panegyric from Jane on his diffidence and the little value he put on his own good qualities. So Elizabeth says, good for you, Jane. You're finally realizing that Caroline Bingley doesn't mean you the best intentions, and Elizabeth wouldn't want Jane to just be fooled by Caroline again. Bingley also tells Jane that the only reason he didn't return from London was because he was convinced or persuaded, we know by Mr. Darcy, but Jane doesn't know that, was that he was convinced that Jane was indifferent and didn't love him. And then Elizabeth said he made a mistake, but it's because he was a modest person, so he undervalued his own good qualities. And then Jane talks about how he's very modest and goes on and on. Elizabeth was pleased to find that he had not betrayed the interference of his friend, for though Jane had the most generous and forgiving heart in the world, she knew it was a circumstance which most prejudiced her against him. So Bingley does not tell Jane that Mr. Darcy had any part in that persuasion, and Elizabeth's glad because she doesn't want Jane to think poorly of Mr. Darcy. I am certainly the most fortunate creature that ever existed, cried Jane. Oh, Lizzie, why am I thus singled from my family and blessed above them all? If I could but see you as happy, if there were but such another man for you. If you are to give me 40 such men, I never could be so happy as you. Till I have your disposition, your goodness, I never can have your happiness. No, no, let me shift for myself, and perhaps, if I have very good luck, I may meet with another Mr. Collins in time. Elizabeth is joking, of course, there, so she's not thinking of Mr. Collins as the ideal husband. The situation of affairs in the Longbourn family could not be long a secret. Mrs. Bennet was privileged to whisper it to Mrs. Phillips, and she ventured without any permission to do the same by all her neighbors in Meryton, so the gossip spreads that Bingley and Jane are engaged. The Bennets were speedily pronounced to be the luckiest family in the world, though only a few weeks before, when Lydia had first run away, they had generally proved to be marked out for misfortune. I think that last little paragraph of this chapter is a commentary on how gossip can shift so quickly. So a few weeks ago when Lydia ran away, everyone thought the Bennets were so unfortunate, poor Bennet family, and now that Bingley and Jane are engaged, everyone says that they're the luckiest people. So that is chapter 55.